Bonjour, Taji, and welcome to another episode of Métis Time Capsule. You're, of course, with your host, Alexandria Anthony. I'm well, you but standard Bungi, the Red River Dialect greeting taken directly from Cree. Folks, we Métis must really, truly help preserve Bungi, the Red River Dialect. It's truly part of who we are as Métis people, part of our history, our culture, and it is also part of the history and culture of the Red River in Manitoba, Canada. In my studies of Bungi, the Red River dialect, and having the great privilege of hearing it as a child growing up in Selkirk, Manitoba, I found that the most peculiar aspect of Bungi to me is its sound system and its pronunciation. And once you've heard Bungi, the Red River dialect, I can promise you folks, you will never, ever forget it. And it truly is, and this is something myself being a Métis with Red River roots has really perplexed me. And it's really a little known, studied Métis dialect. And that's totally wrong, folks. It should be right up there with Michif in my mind. And it really developed along the fur trade routes, of course, again in Red River area, north of the Forks in Manitoba, Canada. It's also interesting that there were stories that were told by Francis or Frank J. Walters, and these are indeed a very valuable resource. And there's so very few resources out there about Bungi, the Red River dialect. And Walters was born in 1898 in England, but he moved to the Red River settlement as a child in 1904, where he became, and this is exciting, folks, a very fluent Bungi speaker. And as an adult, he worked as a storyteller, and he also was performing and writing stories in the Bungi dialect, and he was telling the stories of the lives of the Red River farmers in the late 19th century. Frank Walters was indeed, in my mind, a historian far before his time, and he was also interested in preserving his wife Minnie Food's Bungi heritage. And Frank Walters' best known article about Bungi is, and I quote, Red River Dialects, Bungi as she is spoke, which also, folks, and a book I recommend appears in his book, Pieces of the Past. And today, folks, we're in for a real treat. We're able to hear some of Frank J. Walters' recordings, explaining in this recording, he's talking about the history, the beginnings of Bungi, and he goes into Bungi or Bungi as he calls it, and it's really the Red River saga. So let's get right into it, folks.
Walters speaking, and I've lived in this district of Petersfield, north of Selkirk, about 33 miles north of Winnipeg for the last 63 years, and lived amongst the descendants of the Selkirk settlers, so I've listened to their conversation and decided that they at one time had a dialect that is not in use today. So having heard about this over the years, I thought I would explain it to on this tape. But afterwards, I have, from my experience among the people, I've written 5 episodes of a man's daily work going around his farm, done in the dialect of the Red River called Bungi. It was the name of the Indians that Miles MacDonnell encountered on the Netley River here, or the River of Death, when they came up in 1812 from Hudson Bay, and he called them the Bungi Indians, although they were Sotus from the American states. They're American Indians, and a mixture of Cree as well. And this here first episode will be on the other side of this tape of my stories. But first of all, I'll explain a little bit about this Bungi. This is a story of a dialect which developed among the Selkirk settlers, the Hudson Bay Company's employees, and the former employees of the Northwest Company, which joined the Hudson Bay in 1821. And others who lived in the settlement were the independent traders, the Metis, the soldiers discharged from the Upper Lawrence and the Lower Fort Garrys, who became settlers, and of course the children born of the mixed marriages between the Indians and the whites. Bungi, sometimes spelled B-U-N-G-Y or B-U-N-G-I, I spell it here B-U-N-G-E-E, the same as MacDonnell did, is a name given to this dialect. And this name appears to have been used first by Miles MacDonnell, an agent of Lord Selkirk in charge of establishing a colony along the Red River. MacDonnell, in a letter to Selkirk, stated that a group of Indians living beside the river were the Sotu, or Bungi Indians. At this time, the Indians called this river the Napusini, meaning River of Death, or actually it means sleeping river, like in death. Several different tribes had occupied the same territory, according to Indian legend. One of these tribes, the Ottawas, were wiped out by disease. It was probably smallpox, as smallpox epidemics were known to have occurred in this area and out west too. And the latest one in 1877, the next was down at Gimli, where a lot of Icelandic people, settlers, died there. The next people to settle in this location were called Pananis, and they called the river by the same name, Napusini, and they in turn were massacred by a wandering band of Sioux. The Ojibways, pronounced Ojibwe, the Crees, and the Sotu were among those MacDonnell encountered by the River of Death. The Sotu, or as MacDonald called them, the Bungis, were really natives of the present state of Minnesota. One member of this tribe, who was an old man in 1912, when he related the following to the present writer, said that when he was a very young child, he was placed behind a bale of pemmican for protection from flying arrows during one of these Sioux raids or attacks. As Indians usually fought a hit-and-run kind of an attack and very seldom did any fighting past the noon hour, the Sotu were able to get away. And they established themselves on this river when they came across the border. They actually came up from Sault Ste. Marie, and their chief was Peguis. Today, this river is called the Netley River, and its banks show little trace of its former occupants. The shore is lined by summer cottages and summer camps surrounded by flower beds and lawns. Gone, too, are the log houses where the friendly natives sheltered settlers during the Métis uprising led by Louis Riel in 1869. Some of them lived in dugouts along this creek under the guidance of that Omaskupanes. He was called Red Thunder in Indian, and he was the chief of these Sotus, and he sheltered some of the Selkirk settlers here on the bank. An early traveler wrote in his journal that he encountered natives growing corn where the big timber starts, a number of leagues upstream from where the Netley River empties into the Red River, the River of Mud, or Winnipeg. Winnipeg, as the Indians called it, and meant turbulent water, but some people have construed the meaning to mean muddy water. There's really no proof of that. No trace of these corn patches remain. At first, Bungi was spoken by the people living along the Red River north of the Forks, when the Red and the Assiniboine rivers meet, the present site of Winnipeg. Later on, as people navigated the lakes and the rivers to the north and the south and to the west, the dialects came into use more in remote areas after the influx of many new settlers bringing with them their own native tongues. This unique speech gradually fell out of use, and today one hears the dialect only in communities bordering Lake Winnipeg and points further north. In the early days, children in the settlement did not have formal schooling, and they simply repeated what they heard from their parents and other adults. Slight changes in the language did occur, however, especially as the second generation of settlers grew to adulthood. The second development resulted in very distinct dialect, Bungi, or Red River lingo as they call it. The people who grew up in this environment spoke softly and pleasantly in a pattern resembling that of a native Indian language, which is picturesque and musical. Basically, Bungi is composed of native Indian words and modified English words, and French. Friends and relatives, for example, Nushishin for granddaughter, Nietzsche for brother, and Nistau for brother-in-law. And a female cousin is called Nini Nushi, while a male cousin is called Nanitowis. And native names are also used for certain commonly used articles. And for plants, for example, a rogan is a birch bark basket or pail. Saskatoon is a wild berry, and Ipiminan is a high bush cranberry, as the Indians called it, and Makusi-minan is a low bush variety. And the settlers spoke of these two types of cranberries as nippies, and when they boil them up, they call it nippy jam. And pemmican is dried buffalo meat and grease and berries mixed in by pounding it into powder. Mendaman also is an Indian word, and it is the Indian native colored corn. The Hudson Bay Company gave pieces of wood instead of cash for furs, and these pieces were of various sizes, with each size having a different value. They were called casters, a term probably derived from castor, a term referring to a young beaver. These and many more words, such as peamy for crooked, and peaked for thin, and gutter for mud and gutter for anything dirty, were all a part of the daily conversation, and ki bakate in Soto tongue also meant thin. Old world words, some of them now listed as obsolete, were also in use then, and one of these was slock, from the Scotch word slocken, meaning to put out a light or a fire. And mooter, meaning to barter or trade goods, was another word the Scotch people brought over. There are also many words similar to the English words, even though different spellings and pronunciations are used and letters are omitted. A few of these are medicine for medicine, daughter for daughter, and separate for separate. Ceased for deceased, that is, a person is dead, and neighbor for neighbor, stubborn for stubborn, and opposite for opposite. The Y was left off words beginning with a Y, thus yesterday became yesterday. And on the other hand, letters were sometimes added as in along, they put an E on the end. Vowels were often exchanged, as in the example daughter, separate, and neighbor, given above. Omission of certain letters was frequent, as illustrated by medicine, ceased, and opposite. Some changes seem to occur to simplify pronunciation because the letter X, for example, was hard to pronounce. A word such as expected would sound like expected, and the combination of two letters like SH in the word should was pronounced should, but such became such, and much became much. This change was typical of words ending in CH. In other instances, the CH or the H might be omitted. Sunshine, they would say sunshine. Perhaps this occurred because the native tongue has fewer consonants than the English, and because words containing letters which are not pronounced at all, or are not pronounced as one might expect in the English language. You leave off some letters like umble. It starts with an H and you say umble. Think of that. A similar occurrence can be seen in the word wood, which is pronounced wood. For wood cut in a stave length, we have a stave length billet or wood. That's the way the old timers would say it. That is a piece of wood cut up to fit the stove. In another type of example, ist for just, we can see both consonant omission and vowel change. For J, they would say DS, making John and James, Zan and James. Other examples show that the substitution of entire words also occurred. To show possession of an article, people would say, I am God, or I'm God, instead of I have. Words order also showed a change. A statement in the negative would be spoken, I not can do it, instead of saying I cannot do it. Repetitions were common. For example, I was born in St. Andrews. In St. Andrews, that's where I was born. Or, that's what he said when he said that to me. The word says was used many times in a sentence. For example, I says sounds like S-E-Z. I says to him, I says, and he says to me. The word like was used for emphasis and to show that a statement is final, as that's the way it is like, and taking one thing with another like, or as the old timers would say it, that's the way it is like, and taking one thing with another like on the average like. For one, they would say on, that is sounds like one, and for she, they would say sa, and sa said to me, see. It is interesting, too, to note that a common practice among the people was to call a male she and a female he. I don't know if he's going up, that's what they'd say, and when they're talking about his wife. Some idea of this dialect can be gained from the following paragraph from one of my yarns of yesteryear series, written in modified dialect. The man has undertaken a mission he must accomplish, and he is to deliver a load of wood to Fort Garry, some distance away, and he is anxious to be off. But because he plans to pick up a load of hay on the way back, he can't afford to waste any time, and he decides to take a neighbor, or a neighbor, as they say, along to talk to. The following is part of the conversation between the two men after he arrived at John James's place, or John James's place. See, that place would sound like P-L-E-Y-A-S, place. This is part of the story that's on the other side of this tape of my first yarn about the man on his farm, called This Is What I'm Thinking, but this is one he picked up his neighbor to go and deliver that load of wood. My trip to the bush come off all right. My luck hold out this time. And I found John James is finishing up his chores. He says to ma, you see that me, they say ma, bye, are you going up? That word bye is B-Y-E, doesn't mean boy like some of them now say boy, boy, boy. They use that as an expression. But this is an expression they use, B-Y-E, bay. Are you going up? And then you're going up to town. He says. And that's what I'm here for, he says, to get you to come along. They put an E on the end of along. Are you game to do that, I says. Sure, he says. I'm not nothing special to do anyhow, he says. So you might as well as take a ride with you. Well, if you has time to, you may just as well as two. Or ist as well as two, they would say. They told him. So he comes a-running. He's not got no body to wave to. Because his deceased wife, his wife died, you see, left him on a stormy day, and when she laid down, she told him. So I would see him later on. That's if he ever gets away there. That meant that if he ever got to heaven, you might see him there, but you didn't expect him to get there very much. Now, what you have just read in the brief study is a brief study of the way the early Red River settlers conversed in the settlement north of the Forks. That is, the forks of the Red River and the Centerboyne that joined together at Winnipeg, where the first settlement started. Much has been written about the Selkirk settlers and the descendants, all of who depended upon one another in order to survive. As the times were very trying during lean times and hardships caused by crop failures and flooding, they and the others developed into hardy people able to cope with whatever the conditions were. They were self-reliant and creative. This was evidenced in their construction of the Red River cart, the flail for thrashing grain, and the cradle for harvesting their crops. They also developed storage of food for winter, when canning and refrigeration were unknown. Besides this, they made their own homespun clothes and yarn. It must also be remembered that all through the years of colonization in North America, the native Indian taught the white settlers many things which helped them to adjust to life in the wilds. How to make use of nature's gifts and how to build water craft from materials found in the wood. And how to dry wild berries, which in the case of Saskatoon make good currants. How buffalo meat could be jerked or dried into pemmican, to say nothing of the remedies and recipes they shared with the whites, remedies made from herbs and roots. of plants and which saved many a life in pioneer days when medical aid was non existent. Living beside the river as these settlers did, they were always sure of a meal of fish. In those days, the sturgeon were plentiful. Stories are told of a sturgeon so big that four men carried one up the riverbank, its body over their shoulders, but its tail still dragging on the ground behind them. With such an abundance of game birds and big game around, the Red River settlers were able to take things as they came. One such thing was the long, cold winters, but they kept snug in their log houses with a fire crackling in their old Karen stove. This was when the women did their weaving and the spinning as they talked with their neighbors about the many things that were going on about them. Meanwhile, their men were out hauling hay or perhaps cutting firewood in the bush. And when spring came and the creeks were running, they would go down to John Tate's mill to get some grain crushed into flour. Some of the wheat was cracked just enough to make the porridge called bustin', roasted first and then boiled. Many an old timer today talks about it as being mighty healthy stuff. That John Tate's mill was down in Parkdale, and the story on another tape here I made about that, and when the old fellow wandered away to die. Among these people, their way of life centered around their church. Their sure and total belief in their God developed in them a certain calmness. They believed that their destiny was in his hands, and this belief, coupled with their sense of good, clean fun and rest at the proper times, helped many of them to live to be a ripe old age. The narrow lots once laid out so that each family could be close together on the riverbanks are being taken up now by people moving out from Winnipeg, where once a man's lot was 4 miles long and one or two chains wide. A chain is 110 feet. Now there are upwards of 20 houses on such a lot.
Very, very informative. And I really enjoyed Frank J. Walters explain about Bungi, the Red River dialect. And here's another example of Bungi. And this is a discussion of Victoria Cottage, also known as Bunn House. And Rachel Bunn is telling the story of how her husband, Thomas Bunn, built a stone house known as Victoria Cottage. Oh, I dust down the road, along the river, 'twill overstand forever, and thinking every morning back and forth he came across from the stone fort he worked thar, but me hoose, mind these walls are stone and 3 foot thick, I's tired of the fluids. I so calm this rivers, being no, don't be fooled. Come sprink this rivers, he's a very wicked up south in Kildonan, and don't the river nigh untook our hoosing the big flood of 52. Man, the people lost everything. Oh, mine heart ache it. We fled men and males to the pains and had a sweet time. Mine thanks to my Thomas Bunn, fien and comfortable, we are certainly and slavet. Foot hein from the river will not flood here. So here's an example, and I want to say a huge thank you to the University of Manitoba Archives Special Collections for the Frank Walters Bungee recordings. And I want to thank each and every one of you out there for joining me on this journey to help preserve Bungi, the Red River dialect. Take care.